They say one man's trash is another man's treasure, and in the case of Glenn James, the statement proves to be true. Except instead of trash, it was a large amount of cash that was accidentally misplaced by the owner. For even the richest of people, finding a huge chunk of change will be a huge deal. For James, a homeless man, it was even more impactful. Placed in a tough position, James came up with a plan for the money, and that's now inspiring people across the world. Hello, wonderful people. I'm Scott Leffler for WonderBot, and here is Homeless Man That Finds a Ton of Money Uses It for the Most Inspiring Purpose. Before we begin, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell for more amazing videos. The United States' biggest cities are all fighting to solve the homelessness crisis, but more and more people keep ending up on the streets. Glenn James was just one of many who called sidewalks and alleyways his living room. James was homeless on the streets of Boston, Massachusetts. A man in his early 50s, he'd fallen on hard times as an inner ear condition that affected his balance made it very difficult for him to get a job. Jobless, Glenn James relied on a local homeless shelter and often panhandled to scrounge together whatever he could to survive. Being homeless isn't easy wherever you are, but the Boston winters were cruel. James suffered. One day, Glenn was in his normal spot outside a Boston area strip mall, hoping for some kindness from strangers. He sat, leaning against the building for support and watching the people walk by. It was then that he noticed something strange. About 100 yards away, there was a black lump on the ground. Out of habit, he was often on the lookout for any discarded items he might be able to use for himself with his very limited resources, so he approached the bundle, unsure of what to expect. As he got closer, he saw that it was a worn black bag. This was a pretty lucky find. Backpacks can be very useful for a transient lifestyle. However, James had no idea just how lucky he was until he unzipped the bag and saw what was inside. Inside the abandoned backpack, Glenn James found a Chinese passport, some personal items, and a whole bunch of cash. There were many $100 bills, James described to NBC. In total, the bag held $2,400 in cash. In addition to the cash, the bag had an astounding $40,000 in traveler's checks. For a homeless man who's forced to beg for money from strangers, this was a treasure trove. That money could change his life and get him off the streets. There was one thing in the way. Glenn James had morals, strong ones at that, but the free cash was tempting. Mustering his resolve, James knew exactly what he had to do. He snagged the backpack and took off, right to the local police station. Officers at the Boston precinct were taken aback when James arrived with the bag of money. He didn't have a penny to his name, but he still did the right thing, and his journey was just beginning. It turned out that the bag belonged to a Chinese student who was studying in the area and had lost track of his belongings. The bag was returned safely, and James became a hometown hero. The Boston police decided they needed to do something for James. Boston Police Commissioner Ed Davis held a ceremony to honor Glenn James and his superior character and honesty. They gifted him a plaque and a televised event on local news. This is when the story of Glenn James caught the eye of Ethan Whittington. Whittington, who worked at a marketing firm, heard about James and his selfless act. He thought it was wrong that James would simply have to return to the streets after being given a plaque and a handshake, so he decided to do something about it. Following the broadcast of James' story, Whittington established an online fundraiser for the homeless citizen. His goal was to assist James in changing his life, ideally getting him off the streets of Boston. Overnight, the fund became viral. In less than 48 hours, the fundraiser collected $73,000 from over 3,000 donors for Glenn James. The money was sent with messages of praise for James. "Such a beautiful person. Reduced me to tears," commented one donor. James was in awe. "I just found James' story to be inspiring," Whittington explained. "We're so inundated with negative news all the time. James gives hope to people and lets them know not all things in the world are bad." The good deed was returned and then some. The fund would total $148,000 for James. When Whittington and James met for the first time in person, they embraced. When asked why he returned the money, his response was simple. "Even if I were desperate for money, I would not have kept even a penny," he said. Not to mention the ever-humble James thanked Whittington repeatedly for starting the fundraiser that would completely change his life. "Thank you. You're the one who deserves the thank you for sure," Whittington replied. Glenn James is one of those rare individuals that restores your faith in humanity. Despite his difficult situation, he was focused on doing the right thing no matter what. His upstanding morals are truly inspiring. The homeless population experiences many hardships that people who have never lived on the streets will never understand. But as evidenced by the story of Glenn James, luck can change in an instant. Elmer Alvarez was homeless. The freezing winds and the snow piles that accumulate faster than snowplows can sweep him away were more dangerous to him than a guy in a heated home, car, and office. Still, he already had several winters in New Haven under his belt, so he understood the difficulties of the months ahead. Times had been worse for Elmer, despite his current situation. Drug addiction had led Elmer down a difficult path. Even though he didn't have a stable place to rest his head each night, he managed to kick his addictions by attending NA meetings. Talk about beating the odds. Unfortunately, finding a way out of being homeless constantly tormented him. Getting yourself off the streets is much easier said than done. But pacing the familiar streets on one chilly November morning, Elmer walked right up to an opportunity. Right in the center of the path was a bit of paper. Most people wouldn't give the scrap a second chance, but Elmer stopped and examined the forgotten note. It wasn't a discarded receipt or a bit of trash. The paper was a freshly signed check. Air whooshed from his lungs when his eyes landed on the amount written on the line. The amount of the check was a stunning $10,000. With it endorsed and ready to go, Elmer could have transformed his life with that kind of cheddar. No one was around. Nothing was stopping him from running to the nearest bank. But taking the money never crossed Elmer's mind, not for a second. He turned the check over and, lo and behold, a phone number was in fact listed on the back. Elmer walked the streets until he finally managed to track down a friend with a cell phone. As a Spanish speaker, he had his friend make the call to the check's addressee. At the same time, in an office a few blocks away, a prominent businesswoman heard her phone ring. Roberta Hosky, a self-made real estate magnate, was CEO and president of both Outreach Realty Services and Outreach School of Real Estate. She answered the call. On the other line, Elmer's friend explained that his friend found a substantial check and wanted to return it to her. Roberta was floored. Had she really lost something so important? She rifled through her bag, not believing it was possible, only to quickly realize he was right. Shocked that someone was kind enough to reach out, she agreed to meet him immediately. Once on the street, Roberta opened Facebook Live to document the resolution of the stranger's good deed. She spotted Elmer and his friend and couldn't thank them enough for doing the right thing. With Elmer too polite to draw attention to himself, his friend let Roberta know her savior was, in fact, homeless. This struck a chord with Roberta on a personal level that made the events all the more meaningful. See, before she was a high-powered real estate queen, Roberta faced similar obstacles to Elmer's. At 17 years old, Roberta was pregnant. To care for her child, she had to drop out of school. She'd been in a financially difficult place to begin with, but now with another mouth to feed, she and her child had no choice but to enter housing shelters to avoid living on the streets. But thanks to a crucial internship at Yale University that catapulted her life out of debilitating poverty, Roberta was able to break out of the cycle. But she never forgot her time in the shelters. It was because of her past that she knew that her run-in with Elmer was not a coincidence. She resolved to take the opportunity to pay it forward, in a big way. Telling Elmer to wait right there, she hurried back to her office to get her checkbooks. She wanted to do more for Elmer than just give him some temporary reprieve. While brainstorming on Facebook Live, a suggestion from a follower gave her the idea. Roberta smiled and vowed, "I'm going to teach him how to fish." Back on the street, Roberta handed over a check, this one addressed to Elmer, and he burst into grateful tears. The pair hugged, and Roberta shared her own story with him. Elmer couldn't believe just how much they had in common. Their newfound connection fresh in their hearts, they parted ways. That's when Roberta put her plans into motion. But prejudice reunited them faster than Roberta expected. When Elmer went to cash his check, even with his signature and his ID, shockingly, the bank refused to help him. They suspected it was fraudulent, just because Elmer wasn't their typical customer. A quick call to Roberta erased their unwarranted suspicion about the homeless man. 2 weeks later, Roberta arranged a meeting with Elmer. Thanks to her Facebook video, over 13,000 people heard about Elmer's good deed, and it piqued the interest of the news media. When Elmer walked in the door, he was greeted with applause by a packed room. He was totally overwhelmed. This wasn't what he expected when he agreed to meet. Crazier still, things were about to get even more surprising for him. First, Elmer was presented with a thank you certificate from Miss Millionaire Mindset, an organization aimed at combating poverty. Next, Roberta laid out her true plan to teach Elmer to fish. Elmer was going to be given classes at her real estate school, at no cost to him. But Roberta had another, even bigger surprise. Emotion strained her voice while she explained the best part of her plan. Roberta told him she'd found him a place to live, an apartment he could share with his girlfriend, with the first 6 months of rent and bills completely covered in full. Emotion spilled over. Elmer wrapped Roberta in a hug that said everything he couldn't. Tears streaked his face, and the relief that he wouldn't face another night on the streets washed over him. But Roberta thought of everything, even beyond the 6-month gift. After taking the real estate classes, Elmer was set up with a standing job interview at her colleague's real estate office. Friends joined by a bizarre twist of fate, Roberta and Elmer focused their energies on a project with their nonprofit Outreach Foundation to help other homeless individuals. Their goal was to acquire dilapidated properties and flip them into transitional homes that offer services beyond the average shelter for the homeless. It would grant people the same shot Elmer was given.